On this episode, the toughest subject I've ever had to explain in 2 sentences to start the episode. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. And welcome back to another That's Like WSUD episode, where we are exploring a concept or an idea and how it relates to water-sensitive urban design. Now this episode is part 2 of a 3-part series with interrelated concepts. In the first episode, we looked at cognitive dissonance. In this episode, we're going to be looking at how the contradictions within human cultures cause those cultures to evolve and how that relates to water-sensitive urban design. That's a biggie. And then in the third episode, we will be looking at the concept of the obstacle being the way. So let's get into this. First things first, this concept of how the contradictory views that cultures hold causes them to change and evolve. I was introduced to from the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. I'm quite confident I got that right, but apologies if I didn't. So, in chapter 9 of Sapiens, Yuval explains how. Well, let's go back a step. A really common theme running through Sapiens is how what sets people apart from other animals is our ability to tell stories, and through these stories to construct artificial elements that ultimately become our culture. So in chapter 9, Yuval talks about how these myths, these legends, these stories, these artificial artifacts, even money being one of these kind of human created artifacts, don't exist without humans being here, don't exist without our ability to attach stories to these things like money. That these artificial artifacts, when we add them up collectively, when a group of people adopt similar artificial artifacts together, those collectively become the culture of those people. So when you have a group of people who have similarly put together similar beliefs, similar myths, similar legends, similar likely behaviors, these things collectively become culture. Yuval then goes on to state that early 20th century scholars argued that culture was inherently fixed unless acted upon by an outside force. So that is to say that, say, Aboriginal Australian culture has always been the same, would always be the same, unless an outside force, like colonising British, as actually happened, turn up, and then there would be very, very, very fundamental changes to that. However, Yuval goes on to point out that that's not strictly entirely true. These outside forces, which can also be natural events, they don't necessarily just have to be other human cultures, they can be natural environmental events, environmental disasters, environmental changes. But anyway, Yuval goes on to say that actually the belief now isn't the case that cultures are fixed unless acted upon by an outside event. The belief is that, yes, outside events can change cultures and do, and have very often throughout human history, often with some very terrible consequences. But the cultures are also constantly evolving and changing through their own internal dynamics. And that Yuval argues that the cause for these internal changes is essentially contradictions within the artificial constructs that those cultures are based upon. So the myths, the legends, the stories, the behaviors, the way the monetary system works, all these human constructs are inherently complex and inherently contradictory. To give you a crackingly good example of this, right? The United States of America is the superpower of our time, so no doubt has been successful as a culture by some measure there, but it is very, very clearly contradicted in some of its belief. An obvious example of this is the ongoing debate in America between, do we teach evolution in schools? Do we teach creationism in schools? That is a conflict right at the heart of American culture, and it is a great example of how these conflicts exist within modern cultures. And Yuval argues that as society tries to figure out how to resolve that conflict, is what drives the culture to change. Garbage truck coming past. That's a little, no, we'll just let it get away, let it get quiet again. Okay, so Yuval argues that as cultures work to try and resolve these contradictions in these constructs that are the culture, that is what drives the culture to change over time. So how does this apply to water-sensitive urban design? Well, it got me thinking that if that theory holds right, you should be able to look at a culture, look at where there are beliefs within that culture that are contradictory, and you should be able to predict where, not necessarily how or what that culture will become, but at least where that culture will change and where that change will be driven from. And it got me thinking that we could then apply that logic to water-sensitive urban design. So what we know is that water-sensitive urban design is a pretty new concept. It's been around at most since the early to mid-90s, which makes it just over 20 years old. And it is still continuing to evolve. So if this holds true, we should, and look, we certainly know, if you're practicing in the water-sensitive urban design space, that there are contradictions and conflicts in what we are doing. There's no doubt in my mind that water-sensitive urban design has headed in the right direction since where it began, but it's not perfect and it's not finished and it continues to evolve. So following this train of thought, we should be able to look at water-sensitive urban design, considering it to be a culture of sorts. We should be able to look at it, and we should be able to look and go, what are the things within water-sensitive urban design where there is contradiction, where we are doing one thing and saying another, and those two things don't line up? Now this relates quite strongly back to the previous episode where we talked about cognitive dissonance, because cognitive dissonance is effectively the ability to hold two contradictory views in one's head at once, and then the subsequent stress and pain that causes and how we explain that away. I could see a situation, so if we take the cognitive dissonance theory and the fact that largely when cognitive dissonance exists, we don't want to think about it because it's painful, we could argue that with water-sensitive urban design, if we want to drive it to evolve into something better and something new, we should be looking at the spots in water-sensitive urban design as we currently see it, where there is contradiction, which, because there's contradiction, because of cognitive dissonance, we probably don't want to normally look at. So we probably don't pay a lot of attention to normally. So this is looking at new areas that we don't normally pay attention to. We could be able to look at those areas and see what is likely to drive change in water-sensitive urban design. But also, by default then, if we want to drive change in water-sensitive urban design, where we should focus our attention. So if we want to make this thing better, we can use this theory to go, okay, where is there some contradiction in what we're doing? It's there. Let's apply our effort to try and improve that. So let's try and give a tangible example of this. A tangible example that's close to my heart might be to do with maintenance of stormwater treatment assets. So I've spent a fair part of the past few years trying to improve the processes by which we maintain our bioretention systems and wetlands and all these other stormwater treatment assets that we're building. But when I sit down and I take a deep breath about this and go, how is this going? This would be my, this would be one, yeah, I was going to say my conclusions, but maybe not my conclusions. This would be one way of viewing it, which is we've certainly made progress in Southeast Queensland. We've gone from a situation where essentially no one had a budget for maintaining these assets and wasn't maintaining them, through to the situation where the vast majority of local governments do have a budget and are maintaining them. So we've made progress. At the same time though, we've managed to fundamentally ignore a really big underlying problem here, which is while individual stormwater treatment assets do not cost a lot to maintain and are very simple to maintain, if we are going to make our cities water sensitive through this approach, we are going to need to apply a lot of these assets everywhere. And the sheer volume by which we end up applying them creates enormous requirements for maintenance. And that is problematic. That is dissonant for me because it flies in the face of what I've been trying to do. You know, my belief has been, well, we get maintenance budgets and we start maintaining these things, all will be well. But arguably speaking, the sheer volume is just that's going to be impossible. Maybe not, but it's enough for it to be an awkward truth, right? So following that same logic, it might be, okay, what can we do to reduce maintenance costs? And there are things being done in the industry at the moment, such as a shift in some quarters towards more centralized stormwater treatment assets. But even that has its own slightly dissonant problems, because those centralized systems only marginally, if anything, I have question marks about whether they reduce costs at all, but if anything, they only marginally reduce costs. So then still not dealing with the fundamental underlying problem here, which is how do we make a water sensitive city and not end up with such a sheer volume of assets that even if each one is really simple to maintain, the sheer volume of them is just impossible to. So there's dissonance there. But if we follow the thinking that I have explained or evolved from the book Sapiens, we can then go, okay, let's go and look for these contradictions. Let's go and look for where there's the cognitive dissonance. Let's go and look for where, the things about water sensitive urban design that are painful to think about. Almost certainly those are the bits that are going to drive change in our sector in the future. And let's go and focus our actions around those areas, because that's how we'll get the best change. And that's where I'd like to leave this episode. I'd like to leave that with you there so that you can have a think about that logic. What are the things in water sensitive urban design at the moment that where you see contradictions? Where you see one thing being practiced and another being said? What are those spaces? You'll need to dig deep here. Don't stay superficial here. It's easy. So this is an important point that I'm glad that I have remembered to get to before we finish this episode. I see a difference here between contradictions in what we say and believe and the complaints we make about things not working. So to use a maintenance example here, it's really common to hear the complaint, oh, we don't have enough money for maintenance. That's fine. That's true. But it's not actually where the contradiction lies, because at the moment it's fundamentally really quite affordable for us to set up maintenance budgets for the stormwater treatment assets that we have. That's not where the contradiction lies. That's just a situation of us not having had a budget in the future and us needing to go through the process to get one. That's not a contradiction in this space. The contradiction is, once we've got that budget, if we follow our current practices to their logical conclusion, can we afford to maintain all the assets that we will have in the future? That's a different kettle of fish. We want to find the contradiction, not just the surface complaint initially. So I'd like you to sit down. You can do it standing up if you want. I don't know why I wanted you to sit down, but what I would like you to have a think about is, where can you see contradictions in water sensitive urban design, and where does that lead you towards going, okay, we should focus our actions here if we are going to keep this sector continuing to evolve. I think the thing that you should look out for to tell if you're on the right direction here is, as you look for these contradictions, what does it cause you when you think about water sensitive urban design? What's painful to think about? What makes you nervous when you start thinking about a topic? If you start thinking about something about water sensitive urban design and it makes you nervous, I reckon there's a good chance there that there's a contradiction somewhere in there, and you should explore that deeper. Thank you for tuning in. I look forward to hearing what you come up with, what you think of. But until next time, we'll see you later.